Hello everybody, it's Mr. G, the history teacher, coming at you with another Misconceptions in History. And today we're continuing our series on World War II tanks, and we're going to look specifically at Soviet tanks of World War II. As such, we're going to be mostly focusing on the main line of tanks that was produced by the Soviets during World War II, and what that eventually led to. Now, of course, when I mention Soviets and tanks, the thought that should pop into your head is this right here, the T-34, which was the most produced tank of the Second World War. This actually beat out the M4 Sherman's production numbers by almost 40,000 tanks. But even with building this and mass producing this tank and the tanks that followed it, the path that the Russians took to their tanks that they used in World War II was a really unusual one. Now, during the 19-teens, the Russians did flirt with some unusual designs like this, the Tsar Tank. This unusual design utilized incredibly large spoked wheels. These were about 30 feet in diameter, with the idea being that they could pretty much cross any terrain and not get bogged down, as was seen with early tanks and their Caterpillar-style tracks. However, it was extremely problematic and impractical. It only could travel 10 miles per hour. It was extremely easy to target in terms of artillery fire, and the little rear wheels that it had sank in soft dirt, eliminating the whole purpose of it. Not to be outdone in unusual vehicles, we have the Vezdikod, which was this small tracked vehicle. The initial one was more of an ATV than a tank, and they eventually slapped a turret on it and made it into more of a tankette. Now, towards the end of World War I, the Russians actually became involved in their own civil war, the Russian Civil War, in which you had anti-communist and communist forces fighting each other, and the Allied powers actually intervened on the side of what was known as the White Russians, the anti-communist forces, and provided them with things such as this, the Mark V. These tanks would later be captured by the Red Army and used against the White Army. And interestingly enough, 3 of these tanks were actually used during the Battle of Stalingrad when they were reactivated for service. Additionally, the Red Army rebuilt some Renault FT tanks and used them during the Russian Civil War. It is after the Russian Civil War and the emergence of the Soviet Union, the beginnings of it, that we see the Soviets produce their first domestically designed and produced tank. And that's the T-18, which is essentially a Renault copy with some modifications and improvements made to it. This design was actually unsuccessful, and the only benefit of it was that it gave the Russians the origins, the beginnings of their tank design and development. This leads us into the T-19, which is another Renault kind of copy. By the time this tank was actually produced, it was already outdated and they abandoned it immediately. The next in the line of failures for the Soviets actually came from the T-24, and the T-24 actually had potential. It was actually extremely well armed with 3 machine gun turrets and a 40mm gun on it. However, it was underpowered and had a lot of transmission problems, and they only built 24 before they abandoned the whole project. Now, the success for the Soviets finally came with the T-26, which is basically a British Vickers 6-ton tank copy with a lot of improvements made to it. They ended up making 53 variants of this tank. It ended up being used similar to like the M4 Sherman, in which they just modified the platform for a whole bunch of different designs. These included things like engineering vehicles, remotely controlled tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery tractors, flamethrower tanks. Now, continuing this success is the partner tank to the T-26, which is the BT tank. The BT tanks were what was known as a fast tank, and so because of that, they were convertible tanks. And what that meant is they were actually designed to have their tracks removed and to go into a wheeled configuration, and they went on rubber tires on their wheels. And because of this, the idea was that they could move fast on roads. However, at the time, the Soviet Union didn't have a lot of paved roads, so it was kind of impractical. Next up, we have the T-28, which was actually a multi-turreted tank, with the idea being that it'd have a main gun and had 4 machine guns to support it in its role as an infantry support tank, and it was actually designed to work with a later production tank, the T-35. Now to the most produced tank of World War II, the T-34. And the T-34, when it was produced, it had a more powerful gun than its contemporaries, such as the M4 Sherman, and its 60-degree armor was actually really good against most anti-tank weapons at the time. This tank was important because not only could the Soviets produce it quickly and cheaply, and that's incredibly important in a wartime, but they were easily able to continuously upgrade it and make improvements. And the Germans actually loved this tank to the point that they enjoyed capturing it and just converting it to their use during the war. Also, because of its ease of use in manufacturing and its mass production, it was used around the world even after World War II, and there's believed to be roughly 100 or so that are still serviceable. By that I mean operational, can actually be used, with possibly a few thousand in reserves around the world. Now, the official successor to the T-34 is actually the T-44. There was actually supposed to be a T-43, but that project had been abandoned, and instead they began production on the T-44. Now, the T-44s offered an improvement over the 34. They had better guns, an 85mm main gun. They had much better armor. They actually had better performance across cross-country. However, many of these improvements were already being added to the upgraded 34s, and so only 2,044 models were ever produced. Now, the next big attempt to improve the T-34 came in the form of the T-54 and later T-55 tanks. The Soviets had actually hoped to have this tank ready to go by the end of 1945, but the war actually ended before they could get the prototype model out. So while this wasn't deployed in World War II, it is the last designed tank of the Soviets for World War II. The T-54 and later 55s would actually become the mainstay of the Soviet Union, with roughly 100,000 tanks produced. And like the T-34, this design was again a major change to tank design and would actually influence the development of the American M60 tank. So there you have it, a just quick overview of the main tanks of the Soviet Union in World War II. I know there were other tanks that the Soviets designed, just like everyone else, and I am going to talk about these, what I'm calling the oddball tanks, the unusual tanks. That will be our future series coming up next, where I'm going to look into some things like the mouse tanks and the American T-50s and things like that. All these unusually designed tanks. So I want to thank y'all for joining me today, and I look forward to talking to y'all the next time.